Hi, I'm Rory, and with me is, as always, is Ken. How are you, Ken?
I'm well, thank you for asking. Rory, this is episode 250 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We're so grateful that you've joined us. It just sounds like a magic number,
It
250,
does,
Rory. I don't
doesn't
know
it?
why it is. Yeah, it brings a smile to my face. It's thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in on a weekly basis and supporting us on the podcast that we got to this number. And you can expect three stops on today's podcast, starting off with our theory and practice, where we have a little bit of theory and look at how that presents itself in practice. Rory, you've chosen a beautiful topic today. It is Donald Winnicott, True and False Self.
Mhm.
I've been reading up on that, and that's going to be an exciting one. We then go into practice today, where we look at the contemporary challenges, wins, issues that are facing us in counselling. Protecting your data online. It's becoming more and more important. It's not just our data, it's our clients' data as well. So an important topic for today. And then practice matters, where we look at the CPD element of the podcast. That's the bit that you can mark down as your CPD. And today, an interview with Paula Mayes on working with terminally ill clients. And I know that there is a lecture that has been put into the CPD library on that one as well, but definitely stay tuned for that. But let's get to that theory and practice, Rory, where we look at how the theory shows itself, comes alive in our practice. And Donald Winnicott, True and False Self. Give us an overview of the theory first.
Well, an overview of the theory is that as very little children, in fact, from babies, we develop our personalities, and depending on the kind of caregiving we receive as infants, we'll either be able to express ourselves fully and be ourselves, including, we've all, for those of us who have children or hung around children, that sometimes, children can just kind of show out and have meltdowns and that type of thing. Or if we get the wrong messages, what can happen is we develop a false self. In other words, we develop a self other people expect us to be. And Winnicott would have said that unless we are allowed to develop the false self and fully explore who we are, then we will always be in conflict with ourselves. We'll never really know who we are. And the people who do that and allow us to be our true selves are our caregivers. And he coined the term the good enough mother. I think contemporary therapists would call that the good enough other. Having a primary caregiver or a caregiver who allows the child to be themselves. I'm talking very small children, babies, toddlers, just allow them to be themselves. But I think what's fascinating about this theory, Ken, is how it engages in the therapy room. Because sometimes one of the greatest lessons I've learned through my 2 decades of being in practice is that the children grow up to be adults, and the adults present in the therapy room, for those of us who work with adults, and the kind of mismatches in childhood can come into the therapy room. And we may find ourselves that good enough other, having to help regulate the clients. So understanding this theory and allowing clients to show out. Sometimes we get clients who test us, who push our boundaries, and that really is them showing their true selves.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating bit of theory. What interests me is how it kind of intertwines with other theories. I can't help but think of introjected values, organismic self from person-centered, and how those integrated values kind of adapt our personality and how we might show up. And that we speak about the incongruence if we're speaking about person-centered, where we've got this organismic self or this true self. I'm going to use that word here, that true self, that real self that we don't dare show because we've had messages throughout our life that say that that's not the way to show up, or we've adapted to be, as you beautifully put it, Rory, what other people's might want us to be. And so often we're going to see that within our clients. And as Carl Rogers says, the whole process of therapy and person-centered is to break through to that true self, to dare to be who you truly, truly are. But I guess I recognize even in myself that there are parts of me that are my false self. There are ways that I will show up. And it's interesting that this starts from the early childhood, maybe before we can even recall the memories of that. It might be a little child that falls over and scratches its knee and starts crying it. And maybe the primary caregiver goes, come on, big boys, don't cry. Come on, get over this. Don't cry. And that message of coming, no, don't be that true organismic self who's going, my knee's sore, and the tears going, you got to show up differently. You got to be a big boy. And there we start that adaptation to being that false self, being the self that is maybe more acceptable to those primary caregivers, or we consider it to be that. But yeah, wow. How might we see this showing in therapy? What might be a presentation, Rory?
Well, I think that what might happen is we may get clients who come to us who start, as the arc of therapy sort of starts to move through the arc of therapy, start to show out, may become childish in their affect and their approach to you, may challenge you, may become passively aggressive, if that's a word that people can use. It's not a word I particularly like, I have to say, but it can really push your buttons. And through the years of being a therapist and a supervisor, I've had this on both ends. And also I'll talk a little bit about my own experience of being a client in therapy. And what happens is that the therapist has to be quite robust and quite strong to be able to absorb that kind of movement. It's like waves of emotion that splash over you. And that's why we ask people to have their own therapy, to be able to be strong enough to be able to manage that. And I remember when I a few years ago, I think in 2018, I turned to therapy again. And it was really interesting in a retrospect. I didn't half play out. My therapist did a flipping good job with me. And part of it was to exercise those parts of myself that probably I wasn't allowed to display as a child. It was a really fascinating process. And I'd come away and I think, oh, that's not very good, is it? I should be doing better. That was the whole, that was the whole problem. Here was I walking back to my therapist thinking, should really be doing better in therapy. And I'm thinking, perhaps that's the problem, Rory. Perhaps that's the issue you need to work on. And to be fair to her, she was the good enough other. She was the good enough other. And you can only, it speaks to, I think, a lot of theory, Bowlby's theory of attachment, Mary Ainsworth, of course, Margaret Mailer, splitting and individualization therapy, where children become their own person, develop their own ego and their own sense of self. But I think more fundamentally, it speaks to being loved and respected. And I think that's sometimes something we don't put enough stock in therapy. That humanistic love, that, oh well, it's showing out again. Okay, we'll just go with that and allow them to be. And as that process plays out, what happens is that person can develop a sense of who they are, and it's never too late. That's my message, Ken. It's never too late. I went back to therapy, I think I was 63. Never too late to kind of reclaim those lost parts of self.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. And I'm thinking of what you might see. A client might be in your therapy room and they might relate some part of narrative to you and say something like, oh, that's making me feel really angry. I'm sorry about that. I shouldn't get angry. And that I don't accept what's really going on in my true inner self. Maybe as a child, they were chastised for being showing any kind of anger and suppress that and adapted to be that false self within that moment. So being accepting, non-judgmental of that person, embracing every part of them and kind of showing that, reflecting it back in such a way that the client feels, all parts of me are accepted here. All parts of me are accepted here. It gives a threat-free environment where that person can come and bring parts of their real self. And sometimes they may throw it in, like to test the water. What is my therapist going to do if I show this little part of me? They might throw something in. And without the judgment, with the acceptance, that full acceptance, maybe they can be more and more themselves, as we are that good enough other. I like that, as opposed to good enough mother. I think more contemporary with other, good enough other of not criticizing, not telling a person not to, just accepting their true self. It's truly magical, I think.
And it's a tough call.
Yeah.
Because you've got to tune into that person as a therapist. You've got to really tune into their frequency. And there are some things that we can pick up in terms of using this theory therapeutically. And one of those is separation. So if a client's going away, on a holiday break or something like that, they may struggle not wanting to leave you. And it was Winnicott himself, I think, who coined the term transitional object. So, children have teddy bears and comfort blankets, and those are really representations of the good enough other. They're symbolic little things that people carry to literally hold on to that piece of the caregiver. And, therapists sometimes give books, or I wear sort of like beaded bracelets, and I've sometimes given a client a beaded bracelet, contracted and discussed for them to take away so that they can regulate themselves, and they can bring them back, and they always have, and always given them back to me, and they've always found that useful, so they can develop that sense of self, so they're not in a position where they're yearning for I guess that lost part of themselves. And I think the other thing it shows up in the therapy room is that sometimes clients may give you a really, really hard time. I've had clients who've given me a really, really hard time. And I often think that's possibly a good sign, because it means that they're actually being who they are. You created a condition where they can do that. And I think that can come out in many ways. I think people may say things that could be deemed offensive to you. I personally think that it means that they're exercising their true selves, and they're able to kind of be all of them. I mean, there's a difference between saying offensive things and being offensive to you, but just pushing the boundaries a bit always says that they're exploring that part of themselves. So therapists have to be, pretty robust, I think, Ken.
I think that's a big message here. And you kind of started this by mentioning, that's one of the reasons you're going to your own therapy, so you can look at your own stuff. And when we look to transference, counter-transference, that from our pasts as therapists, when that client is acting in that way that may be uncomfortable for us, how are we with that? And does it kind of key into our past stuff? Does it maybe rub against maybe parts of our false self, as it were, to bring the theory full circle? And we need to know ourselves. And that's part of personal development and ongoing therapy. And you mentioned, Rory, after many years of being a therapist, you dipped your toe back into therapy. Something came up for you. And that is a strength. That is a great strength. There's some modalities, of course, that will require you to remain in therapy for the entirety of your practice. Why? Because it's in service of our clients. Because the better we know ourselves, the more we can be there as our true selves, fully accepting of that person, of who they are, without being triggered or having emotions come up for us. There's a super duper handout for this, of course. You can get Rory's super duper handout, Donald Winnicott, True and False Self. It's a nice, easy 1-byte PDF download, and it's free. When I say 1 byte, it's something you can read really quickly. So you're not going to be going through pages and pages to understand this theory. It's beautifully, elegantly written out. You can get that by going to our website, which is counsellingtutor.com. Highly recommended. If you're a listener to this podcast and you haven't visited our website, go and take a look. It is jam-packed full of resources. In the top menu bar, you'll find the podcast tab. Navigate to 250. That's today's episode right there on the page. All the show notes of what we've spoken about today, links that kind of deepen the topics and understanding that we've been speaking about, and you can get your Donald Winnicott True and False Self download, super duper download from that page. So there it is. There is our theory in practice for today. And I guess as we move on into practice today, which is our next topic, where we look at what are the contemporary challenges, issues, developments that are going on in the counseling world. I think what you've chosen today, Rory, protecting your online data, is a conversation topic of our time at the moment.
You're absolutely right, Ken. I don't think any conversation that I have about therapy with colleagues, it doesn't include at least some reference to online data. And of course, the emphasis is on, as has been, and rightly so, on how we as therapists protect our clients' data. But I was thinking of a slightly different angle on this. How do we offer ourselves, if you like, a bit of self-care when we are looking for things? What should we be looking for if we access websites, doing some research, or we're signing up for something? What are those things that we should be looking for to protect our data? And the first lesson that I've learned is there's no such thing as a free lunch. If you're getting anything for free, almost certainly at some level there'll be a bit of an exchange. And it's about the honesty of that exchange, I think, Ken. Yeah. So, if you're downloading a handout, we say, do you want to join our mailing list, and we'll send you some more useful information. But here's the thing, we give you the opportunity to opt out. Not every website does that. And I think that's important. And also being transparent on the privacy part of the website page about what you're actually doing in terms of data. Things like, are you registered with the ICO if you're in the UK, or if you're in, the European Union? What organization are you registered with to make you accountable? Your registration number. Who do you contact? If you want to find out what data is stored on you. Is there an address? Is there a phone number? Is there a data protection officer's name? All these things are really, really important. And I think if you look at that first before you click on anything, that really tells you about the integrity of the people that you're gaining the information from. It's really, really important, because once your data you've shared is gone, not easy to get it back, is it, Ken?
No, and there's a great saying, you kind of alluded to it, Rory. If it's for free online, if something is for free, then generally you are the product. And there's monster businesses like Google, where you go, Google's great because Google's free. But if you're using Google Documents, Google Calendars, Google email addresses, you are agreeing for your data to, in limited ways, your data to be harvested. Now, with Google, I gave myself a big scare, because you can actually request from Google what information they hold on you, because you should be able to do that from anybody you share your data with. It's a law. It's a law certainly here in the UK. It's a law in the US, where you can say, tell me what data you hold on me, and they will give that to you. I went to Google, and you can try this yourself if you want to. Just go onto the Google search engine and say, Google request my data, do a search, and you'll find their little page for that. And you fill in who you are, and they sent me my data. It was masses and masses and masses of data.
Yeah.
Things that I'd forgotten about, pictures that I'd uploaded years and years ago, Rory, that I'd forgotten I even had, were still there, still indexed by Google. They still held that data. Contacts that I had. So they even had contacts, people that were in my contact list from Google Calendars and things like that. They had the data on that. I was very, very surprised at the amount of data that was held. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised in this day and age. I think that we need to wise up, all of us. And whether you're a therapist or not a therapist, online, it is a transfer of data. That's what online is. And when you are giving some of your information, when you are joining something, when you are signing up, look at the privacy policy, because the privacy policy by law has to be there. Specifically in the UK, GDPR suggests any website should have a privacy policy. And that includes yours. If you're a therapist, if you're a practicing therapist, and you do not have a privacy policy, then it's a good idea to check up on that, because it is a legal requirement. If you're collecting any form of data, if you're not collecting data, then it's not necessary. But you should still have a privacy policy anyway, explaining what plugins you use on your site and who people can contact. But within that privacy policy, it will outline what data is collected, how that data is used, who that data is shared with. And there are some times when you might share your information where you're not just sharing it with the company that you think you are. They may say something like, share with us and our partners and affiliates. And we don't know who their partners and affiliates are, meaning that they are distributing that data. Privacy policy is where it tells you how your data is treated, what to do if you want your data to be removed, because you have the right. So, for example, if somebody holds your data and you don't want to have that data with them anymore, you have the right. If it was with Counselling Tutor, there is on our privacy policy page, it'll tell you exactly who to write to or who to email to get your data removed, and all of your data will be removed. You have that right. How we manage our data, I think in this day and age, is so important.
You're absolutely right, Ken. And I also think that the right details for data protection are important. You know, we're under the 2018, well, it's now the UK Data Protection Act, because we separated when we moved into, with Brexit. But it should be the 2018 Act reference to that. And also, I think that it should be detailed enough for you to make a choice about should you be giving your valuable data to that website, because it's, make no mistake, your data is valuable. It's information. And if you get enough information on somebody, you can literally, I guess, you work out what color socks they're wearing every morning. I'm not wearing any socks today, so I thought I'd share that with you. But you can build quite a profile on someone. And I think that if you are a therapist, you need to be extra careful, because it wouldn't take very much for you to access a website, and maybe your data is sold, to undesirables. I don't want to start a moral panic here, but certainly I'm with a well-known, well-established UK phone company, and my contract ran out about a year ago and I didn't renew it. And then all of a sudden I started getting phone calls from all sorts of people offering me this contract and a new mobile phone and, would I like a holiday in Barbados and that type of thing. And I'd never asked for that. And they'd sold my data. Simple as that. They must have sold my data. So we need to be very careful, about what data we share, and also the sites that we engage with, because if they haven't got a clear, transparent policy with all the details we've outlined, then you may want to put a question mark there and think maybe I need to do a little bit more thinking about before I engage with that particular organization.
Yeah, and I guess the reason we wanted to cover this, and we're speaking now specifically about your data as the counselor, as the psychotherapist, and yes, of course, there's the irritation side of it, maybe getting emails from people that you didn't kind of sign up for, maybe their details have been sold on, and that is really irritating. But there is another side to this as well, and it is that the data, it doesn't go away. It is retained. When I spoke about how it was with Google, I was looking at photographs of myself long before I trained even to become a therapist. That's how long that data has been collected. Google's been going for some time now. It's that recognition that anything we're putting out there, it has longevity. It doesn't go away. So we got to be really careful of what part of us we do put out there, because maybe a client might search for us. They might do a search for you as their therapist, thinking, I wonder who this person is. What are they going to see? Are they going to see any social media? Are they going to see any posted photographs? Are they going to see any kind of conversations that you might have? And sometimes we can think that those conversations might be private. So, well, I'm a member of a special Facebook group. And of course, we've got the Counselling Tutor Facebook group, which is only for counselors and psychotherapists. And that front door of that is vetted in terms of who can come in and join those conversations. But the realism is, it is on an open platform called Facebook, which is run by a company, Meta, whose sole purpose is to make profit from advertising. So yes, maybe it's slightly shielded from other eyes, but the data is still there. So the conversations that we're having online, the information we're putting out, remains for a long time. And I guess one of the things that certainly you taught in my counselling training, Rory, was think carefully of what part of you put out when you're becoming a therapist, because you don't know where that may show up in the future and who might see that.
Oh, absolutely, Ken. I'm so glad you mentioned our Facebook group. And if you want, all that being said,
if you've not been scared away,
if you've not been scared away, if you want to join our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, and we are a closed group. You can only get in by knocking on the door, and our lovely moderator will let you in, and you can join thousands and thousands of like-minded people. We have therapists, we have students, we also have tutors and supervisors, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. So please come on in. But you're absolutely right. Being thoughtful about what is online is really, really important. And you know, I can remember one of my students said to me, "I've done a search for your name, and it's come up as Rory Lees Oakes married." And I searched Google. I mean, I don't search my own name, but I put Rory Lees Oakes, and on the bottom it said, "Is Rory Lees Oakes married?" And it's like, how fascinating. Somebody or a number of people have tried to find out if I'm married, and I thought that was fascinating. That was mainly down to the fact that I was on YouTube, so possibly people want to know a little bit more about me. But you've got to be careful. There's a lot of politicians, a lot of people in the media, a lot of people in newspapers who've regretted posting things on social media, and who have in fact come mightily unstuck. Politicians usually, I have to say, Cam.
Yeah. Well, there you have it. It's just about, I guess, watching how we tread and being mindful of the state of the world that we live in at the moment, and working within the legislation, checking that whoever we share our data with are compliant and are the good guys, as it were.
Yeah.
That is practice today. So moving away from practice today into what we call practice matters, it's the CPD element of the Counselling Tutor podcast. And Rory, you met up with and had an interview with Paula Mayes on working with terminally ill clients.
I did, Ken. And if you remember in podcast 249, we talked about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And I think it's a real good follow-up interview with Paula Mayes, who talks about working with terminally ill clients. It's a fascinating insight into a client group that sometimes isn't particularly well represented or well serviced. And this is what she had to say. And we welcome Paula Mayes, who's done a fabulous lecture for the Counsellor CPD Library on working with terminally ill clients. So, Paula, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Yes, it is the morning when we record this podcast. And indeed, you've delivered a lecture on something I think that people are really, really going to be interested in, and that is working with terminally ill clients. I guess the first question is, what are the challenges for clients who are trying to access therapy if they're terminally ill?
I think from my experience, the counselling is only available through charities or cancer centres. So places like the Maggie Centre, Macmillan Centre, and often if they're there for their treatment, they don't really want to be there for therapy as well. Because if you're having, say, radiotherapy every single day, you don't then want to go for an additional appointment to see a therapist. So that's the initial challenge. Then you have cost, because everything goes awry once you have a terminal illness, including finances. And there are some charities out there who offer it for free, or they're time limited, so you might only have 6 sessions. So there's quite a lot. And then the psychological impact is you don't have the headspace for it. You've just been told you're dying. You know, it's hard to kind of connect with what will be helpful now.
And that really is the existential touchstone, isn't it? Somebody has a terminal illness, they will die. You know, all of us at some point will die, but for people with terminal illness, it means that they know roughly when, or they have a time span for that. So with that in mind, how best does a practitioner offer a service to the client, considering that they may have to come into the hospital or the environment where they're being treated. They may be unwell. They may have a whole host of emotions around having a terminal illness. Where does a practitioner begin with that?
I think it's addressing self, which I'm sure any person who wants to get into any field, they'll need to address how they feel about it. And I think what I've experienced is the work finds you. So it's not like I decided, right, I'm going to get into the death business. But then I became interested in reducing stigma and encouraging conversations around death. So it started with my own morbid fascination, perhaps, and understanding how you feel about it. Because for some people, it's a very big subject. So it's knowing it can be quite challenging for people. So it's knowing all of that and going into it with your eyes wide open. Yes,
and I think like with any counselling engagements, it is always about understanding your own process to the presenting issue, isn't it?
Yes.
And I guess one of the things I work for a hospice for a short time, a short engagement with a hospice. One of the things they asked me at the interview was, had I ever been affected by cancer? And both my parents died of cancer, and that was seen really as a good answer to the question, if there can be a good answer around death, in the fact that I had an understanding of the wider impact of death. Do you think that in terms of that introspection that a therapist needs, that is an important factor?
I do. I'm sorry to hear about your parents. Cancer seems to touch everyone. I think there is a death competence with this. When I speak to funeral directors or the health professionals, I won't say desensitized, but you do develop a toughness to this, and also a really deep sensitivity. So it's like a paradox, really, because you can't talk all day, every day about death and it not have an impact. So I suspect when the hospice were interviewing you, they wanted to know how competent you were with the subject matter, I believe. And I think you do have to have that depth and that breadth of knowledge, because it's not just death, it touches everything.
Absolutely, and it is, as to use a bit of a worn out cliche, it is the ripple effect. It ripples out, and I also think that, and maybe you have a different view, but in our society, people openly talk about things like sex, sexuality, gender. Every aspect of life is explored and kind of inspected at great detail, but death still seems to be one that people don't really want to inspect. Would I be right in that, or has things changed?
No, you're absolutely right. I think it is improving, but it's almost that Victorian kind of view of death, where if you talk about it, you're almost bringing it into your life. Like you can somehow tempt fate of death, or, don't speak ill of the dead and all this kind of thing. And I think with the explosion of social media, death has kind of taken on a different flavour, really. For example, people may take photographs at funerals. And I think I touched on this in my presentation. And that to some generations may not go down at all. But I think while the younger people are posting on social media, it is encouraging a conversation of sorts. But I think there is still that stigma. I'm not sure if you're aware of death cafes, but that's an opportunity for people in our field, or who have this fascination, to talk about death in a way that there is no stigma, there's no shame attached.
Oh, I'd like to hear more about death cafes. I've been in some cafes where I thought I was going to die, I have to say. But a death cafe, what's a death cafe?
So a death cafe is exactly what it says, really. So it's not therapy of any sort. It's people coming together who want to talk about death. And it can be they want to share their experience. They want to sense check that what they're going through is normal. They're often quite light-hearted events, because I think the people who want to have these conversations are able to hold death in such a way that can be light and sometimes funny. There's often cake, lots of caffeine flowing, so people are generally in a good mood. But then you do get the tears and the reflective side of it. So you're with like-minded people at a death cafe, and I work in Leeds, and Leeds Bereavement Forum hold death cafes. Usually once a month. We did them online throughout the pandemic, and I think they're just reintroducing the face-to-face ones at the moment. And again, people really enjoy that sort of thing, and then absolutely would think it was the worst thing ever to attend something like that. So
Yeah,
it can be quite divisive.
it can be, but I guess it speaks to the changing attitudes and the way people engage with death. And I come back to your earlier point where you were speaking about we have a very Victorian idea of it. We they used to cover statues up and it shouldn't be spoken about. And even when I was a young man, people used to close their curtains.
Yes.
As if you couldn't look at it because it was so terrible, and wear black armbands, and that I sound like I'm ancient, don't I? I'm not a Victorian by any stretch. Yeah, I know, but that was still certainly in the working class community that I came from.
Yes.
There was still very much that sense, that Victorian sense, and I guess one of the things we need to think about when we are working with terminally ill clients is how their culture impacts on their view of death. So different cultures would have a different view of it.
Yes, definitely. Just as you were talking then, Rory, I was really aware of Irish Catholics who perhaps would have an open coffin, and it will probably just be on the dining table so people can pay their respects and visit the dead body and pass on the condolences to the family. And a lot of that was halted through the pandemic, and we saw a real shift in how people were grieving because these rituals are so important, and they were arrested. They weren't able to grieve and process in the same way. I'm not sure if I've answered your question there.
Well, you have, and I think it's interesting that different. I mean, I was reading somewhere that in Swedish culture that people, when you get to a certain age, start to clear out the belongings in preparation for death. And we think of military service. The American Army have a very strong ritual about what they call the last roll call, where they'll call out the names of a platoon, and then the person who doesn't answer, they'll call that name again to signify that person has died. And if anybody wants to search YouTube for last roll call, it is incredibly poignant. It is incredibly poignant.
Moving.
Yes, it comes. I believe it comes from the War of Independence, or the Civil War, the American Civil War, excuse me. And it's a tradition that American military have taken over and used ever since. But it's incredibly moving and significant. So being aware of the cultural aspects of death, because not every culture will have their different ideas. If someone is dying, they'll have their different ideas, and maybe those ideas of where they're going as well. Yes. They may talk about where they'll be going.
Yes, and spirituality comes up quite a lot. So it could be somebody has been religious and then their faith has lapsed perhaps, and then they're told they have something terminal, and suddenly faith can be really, really important to them. And they often have strong views about what happens when you die. And, people, even if they aren't religious and perhaps they're very logical or scientific, perhaps they can suddenly find something that's of a different realm that they've never experienced before, such as spirituality. And they're having conversations with their family members about hauntings or reincarnation or things that they've just never entertained before. And it's really interesting to be part of that conversation because they're learning. And that's what I love about working with these clients, is they don't stop living just because they've got a death diagnosis, a prognosis. And that's what I really enjoy is that they're continuing to still live.
I think that's incredibly powerful, because with most counselling, when the engagement's ended, counsellor may very well think, or psychotherapist may very well think, look, that client will go into the world, they'll live their lives, they'll take the therapy away. What they've identified in themselves, they'll change. And I think the thought may be that with terminal ill clients, that might not be the case because of the terminality of it.
Yes.
But it sounds to me that's not the case. People may find things about themselves as they're coming to the end of their lives, and that is a form of personal growth.
Yeah, it's such a testing time. And they may make new connections. They may meet someone in a hospice or the funeral director. And when you're approaching end of life, especially if you're quite an older person, you don't think you're going to make any new connections. You think you've got all your friends around you. So then for someone to actually engage and make that new connection towards the end of their life, it's beautiful to see, really.
Yes, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you about something that possibly isn't talked about enough. So I guess my final question is, what do you hope people will take away from your lecture?
I hope that it will be a topic for exploration, and that the topic of death is not so big and so overwhelming that it puts people off. I hope my presentation is a bit of a taster and a bit of an introduction to just give people some insight into giving it a go.
Well, working with terminally ill clients, the lecture is available in our CPD library. And Paula Mayes, thank you so much for joining us.
Big thank you to Paula. Big thank you to you, Rory, for, of course, hosting that interview as always. And of course, if that was interesting to you and you want to learn more about working with terminally ill clients, there is an entire lecture presented by Paula Mayes, and that is available in the Counsellor CPD library. The Counsellor CPD library is a library absolutely jam-packed full of high-quality, learning outcome-based CPD that is applicable for you within your practice. And our annual fee for membership of the CPD library costs less than the price of a cup of coffee per month with a friend. So it really is worth having a look at. Just go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is there. If you are a member of the CPD library, log in, go and enjoy that lecture and grab your certificate on that. This has been episode 250 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
It has. And we started off with theory and practice. We talked about the work of Donald Winnicott, and of course, true and false self, how it presents in children, but how it presents in our practice. In practice today, we talked about the all-important self-protection of looking after your own data, protecting your data and your own privacy. And then finally, in practice matters, we had an interview with Paula Mayes working with terminally ill clients. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.